I want to go to Paula Reed. She's been reading through the opinion. Paula, what are you gleaning from it?
All right, Pamela, here's what we know. This is a big win for President Trump because he has been railing against the so-called nationwide injunctions. This is the power of a single judge to block an executive order for the entire country. And this case came up as a result of multiple challenges to his effort to limit birthright citizenship through an executive order. Now, here it appears that the justices are agreeing with Trump and limiting this power that judges have to block a policy for the entire country. Now, on another issue, it does not appear that they have weighed in on whether Trump's effort to limit birthright citizenship is or is not constitutional. Instead, they are limiting the power of these judges to block policies for the entire country, which will likely allow Trump to proceed with this effort to limit birthright citizenship while the larger constitutional questions about whether he can do that are being litigated. Now, just to explain to you the significance of this, one of President Trump's lawyers told me this is the ball game for President Trump's agenda because we know more than any modern president, he loves to govern through executive action.
Stop what you're doing right now because the Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell that has the White House in absolute panic mode. The highest court in the land just issued an emergency order requiring President Trump to testify in a federal case. Not suggested, not requested, ordered. The Supreme Court of the United States has compelled the sitting president to take the stand and testify under oath, and the White House reaction has been total chaos. Emergency meetings, frantic phone calls between lawyers, political advisors scrambling to figure out how to spin this, security briefings being convened, because when the Supreme Court orders a president to testify, there's no appealing that decision. There's no higher authority to run to. That's it. Trump has to testify or face contempt charges that could include everything from massive fines to potential detention. This is unprecedented. We've never seen anything quite like this in modern American history. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
To talk a lot more and break down what we just sort of learned there, I want to bring into the conversation legal analyst Nima Rahmani. Nima, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Of course, when it comes to some of these SNAP issues, it really hits home for people. We were just listening into that press conference with that man talking about he's disabled, he's on a fixed income, and these SNAP benefits are not coming. What did we just now learn through the court system as the government still remains shut down at this hour?
Let me put this in perspective for you. Presidents have testified before. Bill Clinton testified in the Lewinsky case, for example, but that was a civil deposition in a private lawsuit. This is different. This is the Supreme Court issuing an emergency order compelling presidential testimony in a case involving alleged violations of federal law related to troop deployments and emergency powers. This is about Trump's official actions as president, about whether he violated constitutional limits on his authority. And the Supreme Court just said you don't get to hide behind executive privilege or presidential immunity. You have to show up and answer questions under oath. That's a massive expansion of judicial power over the presidency, and it's happening right now in real time. The case itself involves Trump's attempts to deploy federal troops and use emergency powers in ways that multiple courts have said exceeded his constitutional authority. Judges have cited insufficient evidence for federal intervention. They've said Trump's justifications for these deployments don't meet legal standards, and they've ordered him to appear in court to explain his actions and defend his authority. Trump's legal team has been fighting this for months. They've filed appeals. They've made emergency requests to higher courts. They've argued presidential privilege. They've claimed executive immunity. They've used every legal maneuver available to avoid Trump having to testify. And the Supreme Court just shut down all of those arguments and said, no, the president must testify. The emergency nature of the order makes this even more significant. This wasn't the result of a lengthy Supreme Court deliberation with oral arguments and months of consideration. This was an emergency appeal that the court decided quickly and decisively. Trump's lawyers apparently made one last desperate attempt to get the Supreme Court to block lower court orders requiring his testimony. And the Supreme Court not only denied that request, they affirmed the lower court orders and made it clear that Trump has to comply immediately. That speed and decisiveness suggests the Supreme Court believes this is a clear-cut issue where the law requires presidential testimony despite any claims of privilege or immunity. The White House response has been described by insiders as panic, pure panic. Nobody was prepared for the Supreme Court to rule this way this quickly. Trump's legal team apparently believed they had more time, that they could drag out the appeals process, that they could find some procedural way to delay the testimony until the political situation changed or the case became moot. But the Supreme Court just slammed that door shut. So now White House lawyers are convening emergency meetings, trying to figure out what to do. Do they comply and prepare Trump to testify? Do they look for some way to challenge or resist the order, even though there's no higher court to appeal to? Do they try to negotiate terms of the testimony to minimize damage? Every option is bad. Every option has serious consequences. The political implications are staggering. If Trump has to testify under oath about his use of emergency powers and federal troop deployments, he's going to face incredibly difficult questions. Questions about what authority he believed he had, questions about what advice he received from lawyers and military officials, questions about what his true motivations were, and he has to answer all of this under penalty of perjury. One false statement, and he's looking at criminal charges. One admission that contradicts his public statements, and he's handed his opponents massive ammunition. There's no way Trump testifies without creating enormous political problems for himself. But there's also no way he defies a Supreme Court order without triggering a constitutional crisis that could destroy his presidency. Legal experts are calling this a watershed moment, a new era of judicial assertiveness against presidential privilege. For decades, courts have generally given presidents wide latitude and deference. They've been reluctant to force direct confrontations between the judicial and executive branches, but this Supreme Court order signals that those days might be over, that courts are willing to compel presidential testimony and cooperation even over vigorous objections about privilege and immunity. That's a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Let's break down exactly what the Supreme Court ordered and what it means. All right, let's dig into the details because this Supreme Court order is incredibly consequential and the full story is even more dramatic than the headlines suggest. First, we need to understand what case this testimony order relates to. This stems from multiple legal challenges to Trump's use of emergency powers and federal troop deployments. Throughout his second term, Trump has been pushing the boundaries of presidential authority. He's claimed emergency powers to deploy troops domestically. He's invoked various statutes and constitutional provisions to justify using federal forces in ways that many legal experts say exceed presidential authority. And multiple parties, including state governments, civil rights organizations, and even some members of Congress, have sued to block these actions. Lower federal courts have been skeptical of Trump's legal justifications. Multiple judges have ruled that Trump's claimed emergencies don't meet the statutory requirements, that his deployments violate constitutional limits on federal power, that he's exceeded the authority granted to him by Congress. And crucially, these judges have said that Trump needs to appear in court to defend his actions under oath. They've rejected claims that presidential privilege allows him to avoid testifying. They've said that when a president's actions are challenged as exceeding his constitutional authority, he can't hide behind executive immunity. He has to defend those actions in court like anyone else. Trump's legal strategy has been to appeal every adverse ruling and use every procedural tool to delay having to testify. His lawyers have argued that forcing a sitting president to testify would interfere with his ability to govern, that it would set a dangerous precedent where presidents are constantly dragged into court to defend their decisions, that presidential communications and decision-making processes are protected by executive privilege. These are all arguments that have worked to some degree in past cases involving presidents. Courts have generally been reluctant to compel presidential testimony except in extraordinary circumstances. But this Supreme Court just said these aren't ordinary circumstances. These are cases challenging the fundamental constitutional authority of presidential actions. And in those cases, presidents don't get to avoid judicial scrutiny by claiming privilege. The Supreme Court's order was issued in response to an emergency appeal from Trump's legal team. After a lower court issued yet another order requiring Trump to appear for testimony, his lawyers filed an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court asking for a stay. They wanted the Supreme Court to block the testimony requirement while they continued to fight the underlying legal issues. This is a common legal tactic. When you get an order you don't like, you ask a higher court to stay that order while you appeal, and often higher courts will grant stays just to preserve the status quo while they consider the legal arguments. But the Supreme Court denied Trump's stay request. And they didn't just deny it. They affirmed the lower court's reasoning and made clear that the testimony must proceed. That denial is significant for several reasons. First, it suggests the Supreme Court believes Trump's legal arguments against testifying are weak. If the court thought there were serious legal questions that needed to be resolved, they likely would have granted at least a temporary stay. But they didn't. That tells you the court thinks the law is clear. Presidents can be compelled to testify about their official actions when those actions are challenged as exceeding constitutional authority. Second, the speed of the decision is notable. Emergency appeals can sometimes take weeks to decide as the court requests briefs and considers the issues. But this decision came down quickly. That suggests the court viewed this as straightforward, no complicated legal analysis needed. The lower courts were right, and Trump has to testify. Third, the order specifically references the power of courts to enforce contempt proceedings and remove presidential shields. That language is important because it makes clear the Supreme Court is prepared to back up this order with real consequences if Trump tries to defy it. Contempt can mean fines, it can mean sanctions against Trump's lawyers, and in extreme cases, it can even mean detention. Now, nobody seriously thinks the Supreme Court would order the arrest of a sitting president. But the fact that they're explicitly mentioning contempt powers is a shot across the bow. It's the court saying we're serious about this, don't test us. The underlying legal issues are fascinating from a constitutional law perspective. The question is essentially, where is the line between presidential discretion in exercising executive power and judicial authority to review whether the president has exceeded constitutional limits? Presidents have always had broad discretion in areas like national security, emergency response, and use of military force. Courts have traditionally been reluctant to second-guess those decisions. The political question doctrine says courts should stay out of disputes between the executive and legislative branches over how power should be exercised. And executive privilege protects presidential communications and deliberations from being disclosed in legal proceedings. But Trump's lawyers have apparently pushed those doctrines too far. They've argued that essentially anything the president does related to national security or emergency powers is unreviewable by courts. That judges have no authority to question presidential decisions in those areas, and that the president can never be compelled to explain or defend those decisions in testimony. The lower courts and now the Supreme Court have said no. That goes too far. Yes, presidents have broad discretion. Yes, courts should defer to presidential judgment in many areas. But when a president's actions are challenged as fundamentally exceeding constitutional authority, courts have the power and duty to review those actions. And part of that review can include requiring the president to testify about what he did and why. The political ramifications of this order are enormous and playing out in real time. The White House is in damage control mode. Trump's political advisors know that having him testify under oath is incredibly risky. Trump is not known for being careful with his words. He tends to exaggerate, make unsupported claims, and say things that are contradicted by documentary evidence. That works fine in campaign rallies or friendly interviews. But under oath in a courtroom, it's a disaster waiting to happen. One false statement, even if it's unintentional, and Trump could face perjury charges. One admission that undermines his public narrative and his political opponents will use it against him relentlessly. So the White House has to figure out how to prepare Trump for testimony. They need to do intensive preparation sessions where lawyers grill him with the kinds of questions he'll face in court. They need to review all the documentary evidence so Trump knows what records exist that might contradict his statements. They need to practice staying calm and measured rather than getting defensive or combative. All of this is incredibly difficult with any client. With Trump, who hates being told what to say and often goes off script, it's nearly impossible. The lawyers preparing him are probably tearing their hair out trying to get him to understand how serious this is and how careful he needs to be. The security implications are also significant. Having the President of the United States testify in open court raises all kinds of security concerns. The Secret Service has to secure the courthouse. They have to plan for protests and potential threats. They have to figure out how to protect Trump while also allowing the judicial process to proceed normally. This isn't like a deposition in a private office. This is testimony in a federal courthouse that will be open to the public and media. The logistics alone are incredibly complicated. The media coverage is going to be absolutely relentless. Every major network will cover Trump's testimony live. Legal analysts will dissect every word. Political commentators will spin it in real time. And clips of Trump's testimony will be played over and over for days or weeks. Trump knows this. His team knows this, and that's part of why they're so panicked, because there's no way Trump testifies without creating major news stories that dominate the political conversation for an extended period. Even if he handles the testimony perfectly, which is unlikely, the very fact of a president being compelled to testify under these circumstances is historically significant enough to be a major story. Okay, let's break down what this actually means going forward, because this Supreme Court order has real consequences that are going to play out over the next weeks and months. First, can Trump actually defy this order? Technically, he could refuse to comply, but the consequences would be catastrophic. The Supreme Court has the power to hold him in contempt. They could impose massive fines. They could sanction his lawyers, and theoretically, they could even order his detention, though that would trigger an unprecedented constitutional crisis. More realistically, defying a Supreme Court order would be political suicide. It would hand his opponents proof that he believes he's above the law. It would divide his own party, as even loyal Republicans would struggle to defend defying the Supreme Court. So Trump's options are basically testify or resign. Those are the only realistic choices. Second, what will Trump actually be asked about during this testimony? Based on the underlying cases, he'll face questions about his decision-making process for deploying federal troops. What information he relied on, what advice he received from military and legal advisors, what statutory and constitutional authority he believed gave him the power to act, whether he considered alternative approaches, what his true motivations were. These are all questions designed to probe whether Trump's actions were legitimate exercises of presidential authority or whether they exceeded constitutional limits. And Trump has to answer truthfully. He can't just repeat talking points or give evasive non-answers. The judges and lawyers asking questions will push him to be specific and substantive. Third, what happens if Trump commits perjury during his testimony? This is a real risk. Trump has a history of making statements that are contradicted by documentary evidence or other witnesses. If he does that under oath, he's committed perjury. And unlike lying to the media or the public, perjury is a serious federal crime that can result in prosecution. The judges presiding over his testimony will be watching carefully for any statements that appear false or misleading, and prosecutors would have the option to bring perjury charges if they believe Trump lied under oath. That would create yet another legal crisis on top of all his existing problems. Fourth, how does this affect Trump's other legal cases? This Supreme Court order sets a precedent. It establishes that presidents can be compelled to testify about their official actions when those actions are challenged as exceeding constitutional authority. That precedent will be cited in other cases involving Trump. Other judges will feel emboldened to order Trump's testimony knowing the Supreme Court has backed that approach. So this one order could lead to Trump being forced to testify in multiple cases. That's a nightmare scenario for his legal team because each testimony creates more opportunities for mistakes and damaging admissions. Fifth, what does this mean for presidential power going forward? This is the most important long-term question. If the Supreme Court has established that presidents can be compelled to testify about their official actions, that's a significant check on presidential power. Future presidents will know they can't just claim privilege or immunity to avoid judicial scrutiny. They'll have to be more careful about how they exercise power, knowing they might have to defend their actions under oath in court. Some people will see this as good, holding presidents accountable and ensuring they don't abuse power. Others will see it as dangerous, weakening the presidency and allowing courts to interfere too much in executive decision-making. Either way, it's a major shift in the constitutional balance of power. Now let's talk about what you should be watching for in the coming days and weeks. First, when and where will Trump's testimony actually happen? The logistics need to be worked out. Court scheduling, security arrangements, media access. All of this will be negotiated between Trump's lawyers and the courts. Watch for announcements about timing because that will tell you how quickly this is moving. Second, Trump's public statements. He's probably going to attack this decision, call it a witch hunt, attack the judges, try to rally his base. Watch how aggressive his rhetoric gets, because that will signal how threatened he feels. Third, Republican reactions. How many Republicans defend Trump versus how many stay quiet or even criticize his handling of this situation? If Republicans start abandoning him over defying courts or appearing to be above the law, that's a major political problem. Fourth, preparation leaks. There will probably be leaks from Trump's legal team about how preparation is going. Whether Trump is taking it seriously, whether he's cooperating with his lawyers' attempts to prepare him, those leaks will tell you how likely it is that Trump's testimony goes well or becomes a disaster. Fifth, potential deals or settlements. Trump's lawyers might try to negotiate some kind of settlement or resolution that avoids actual testimony. Courts sometimes allow that if both sides agree. Watch for any signs that negotiations are happening because that would suggest Trump is trying to find an off-ramp. Sixth, the actual testimony itself when it happens. This will be must-watch TV. Every word will matter. Every expression and gesture will be analyzed. This will be one of the most significant moments of Trump's presidency. The constitutional crisis potential here is real. If Trump defies the Supreme Court, we're in uncharted territory. What does Congress do? Does the House impeach him for contempt of court? Do Republicans defend him or join Democrats in holding him accountable? What does the Supreme Court do to enforce its order? These are questions without clear answers because we've never had a president openly defy a direct Supreme Court order like this. The closest parallel is Andrew Jackson supposedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." But that's probably apocryphal and in any case happened in a very different era. Modern presidents have always ultimately complied with Supreme Court orders, even when they disagreed with them. Here's my take on what this means. The Supreme Court just told Trump he's not above the law, that he can't hide behind executive privilege when his actions are challenged as exceeding constitutional authority, that he has to face the same judicial scrutiny as anyone else. This is either a triumph of rule of law and accountability, or a dangerous erosion of presidential power, depending on your perspective. But regardless of how you view it, it's a watershed moment. The relationship between the presidency and the courts has fundamentally changed. And Trump is the test case for how this new dynamic works. So what's the bottom line? The Supreme Court issued an emergency order compelling Trump to testify about his use of emergency powers and federal troop deployments. The order overrides all of Trump's claims of privilege and immunity. The White House is in panic mode trying to figure out how to handle this. Trump's options are testify, settle, or defy the order and trigger a constitutional crisis. The testimony will be incredibly risky because one false statement means perjury charges. The political implications are enormous because even perfect testimony creates damaging optics, and the constitutional precedent is significant because it establishes that courts can compel presidential testimony about official actions. Watch for timing announcements, Trump's public reaction, Republican support levels, preparation leaks, settlement negotiations, and eventually the testimony itself. This is a defining moment for Trump's presidency and for presidential power generally. The Supreme Court just drew a line and said presidents are subject to judicial authority. Trump has to decide whether to accept that or fight it. Either way, the consequences will reshape American governance. Stay tuned because this story is just beginning.